Poštovani gledatelji, dobrodošli u još jednu emisiju Vidljivi tragovi. Danas je naš gost Robin Harris, britanski povjesničar i publicist, nekadašnji savjetnik Margaret Thatcher. Dobro nam došli.
Hvala.
Ja ću još reći par riječi o vama. Dakle, vi ste doktorirali modernu povijest na Oxfordu. Početkom 90-ih angažirani ste u širenju istina o ratu u Hrvatskoj. Napisali ste knjigu o povijesti Dubrovnika, evo i nedavno knjigu o blaženom Alojziju Stepincu, Stepinac, His Life and Times. Dobitnik ste nagrade Andrija Buvina za izuzetan doprinos kršćanskoj kulturi. Na danima kršćanske kulture 2017. dobili ste hrvatsko državljanstvo zbog svog zalaganja za Hrvatsku i trenutačno stalno živite u Zagrebu. Evo, vrlo zanimljivo.
To je zanimljivo i to je istina.
Profesore Harris, postoji li objektivna povijesna istina?
History exists because reality exists. And history is a true story. History is a story about true things, people that exist, things that happen. And so consequently, we have to aim at objective, factual truth. And so history is not to be just subject to interpretation. Inevitably, interpretation comes into it, but there is no excuse to falsify facts or conceal facts or simply use history as a means of political propaganda, which unfortunately does happen. I was, of course, at that time working still for Mrs. Thatcher. She had left office, but I was still working for her. And this was at the time of the collapse of communism worldwide. And the collapse of communism had all sorts of consequences. But one of the most bloody consequences was, of course, in this part of the world. And so I saw what was happening here, and Mrs. Thatcher actually saw what was happening here, as an integral part of the collapse of communism. So inevitably I was interested in what was happening here. But the more that I became interested, the more I saw that there were very deep issues and true values at stake here. And I felt committed, as indeed she felt committed to the cause of Croatia, and indeed of Bosnia later, it wasn't just Croatia, against what she saw and I saw, and what was, absolutely, getting back to your first question, truly an act of aggression from Belgrade, driven by very bad ideology of Greater Serbianism, which is a sort of mixture of communism and, I would say, extreme nationalism bordering on racism, and it had to be stopped. And so when one feels very committed to a cause, as I felt committed to a cause, if you're like me, you want to find out more and more and more about it, and that was really the beginning of my engagement with Croatia. Most of the lies that flow around the world about Croatia and a lot of other things came from the Communist Party in the past, either the Communist Party in Yugoslavia or the Communist Party worldwide. But of course, in the case of Croatia as well, an awful lot of lies then flowed out of Belgrade. But a lot of the lies that have flowed out of Belgrade are actually regurgitated lies from the days of communism.
Kad ste prvi put čuli o Stepincu?
I heard about Stepinac. I'd never heard of him at all, actually, until I started to read, again, the propaganda about Croatia. And of course, part of this propaganda was that the Croats are an inherently genocidal nation, and that if they are ever given their independence, there will be a new genocide against Serbs and anybody else who happens to be in the way, as there was under the NDH. So this is the basic charge. This is why it was believed, and I think unfortunately a lot of people still do believe that they don't actually say it. A lot of people in Belgrade believe that Croatia should not have its own state. And of course, as part of this propaganda war, Stepinac figured highly, because he was the most wicked representative of not just of of the Croat genocidal tendency, but of this clerofascism, as the communists like to call it, clerofascism, which brought together the religious imperialism of the Catholic Church with this terrible instincts of these dreadful Croats. The communists essentially will never like a country that is Catholic, that is socially conservative, that is got deeply rooted values. For example, its countryside, its agriculture, and this sort of thing. The communists do not like this at all, because, of course, they want to have countries where there is a universal deracinated proletariat that they can exploit. And of course that's what they were doing in the 1930s in Zagreb. They were all the people who came into Zagreb then, they were really, already, that's before the Second World War, they were working on these people. And there was a great struggle between the Catholic Church, on the Stepinac on the one hand, and the communists on the other, for the loyalties of this new proletariat in Zagreb.
Ja uskraćam dani odgovor. Moja je savjest čista i nemam se tu ništa prebacivati.
In Western circles who don't know much of this part of this world, much about this part of the world at all, is that in the Second World War, of course, we know that there was the Holocaust, the destruction of the Jews. And there was always deep suspicion of the clergy or anybody else who remained in countries which was controlled by the Axis, where the Jews were exterminated. So there would be telling lies about Stepinac and the Jews is useful. But in fact, it's quite interesting that so there are suspicions about that. But in fact, not even the communists have told many lies specifically about that. They have told lies about the Church in general and Pius XII about silence about the Holocaust. With regard to Stepinac, it's nearly all about the persecution of the Serbs, particularly the ethnic Serbs in Croatia. And the suggestion is not only that the Church said, and Stepinac said nothing, that they said nothing and did nothing to protect the victims of the Ustasha and the Nazis, but that they collaborated, actively collaborated, in the persecution of the Serbs. This is false, but that was the most important charge that was brought against him at his show trial in 1946. Masses and masses of Serb witnesses were brought on, and it was interesting, I think it is interesting, that the ethnic Serb defense witnesses that his defense wanted to bring on they were not allowed into the court. So the question of the persecution of the Serbs, right from the beginning, was used by the authorities to blacken Stepinac, and of course blacken the Church, and of course blacken the Croats. In 1941, when all of this started, Stepinac and the bishops, the Catholic Bishops' Conference, issued public statements which went to Pavlic, but these were official statements that there must be no forced conversions, and also that the question of conversion of Serbs to Catholicism was a matter for the Church and not a matter for the state. Now, it's important, if I may, to just go into why this was necessary. What happened was that right at the beginning of the Second World War, Pavlic and Hitler agreed that there would be a mass deportation of Slovenes to Croatia and a mass deportation of Serbs from Croatia into Serbia. Now, this, of course, pleased Pavlic as well as Hitler, and in the course of this attempted deportation, which was not very successful, actually, they killed an awful lot of people. Great cruelties were committed. That was phase one, if you can say, of the anti-Serb policy. But the second phase was, which is quite a short phase, was forced conversion to become Catholics, and thus it was thought by Pavlic to become loyal Croatian citizens of the NDH. Rather than Serbian Orthodox. And that it was in this second phase that the Church, of course, got involved, because the Church was directly, the Catholic Church was directly involved, and the Catholic Church, with the full support of the papacy, said, we will not have conversions of this sort. If people want to become Catholics, fine, we're delighted to have Catholics, but there must be a sincere individual decision to become Catholics. Now, in fact, the authorities, Stepinac and others, were besieged by Serbs wanting to become Catholics to save their lives. It didn't actually save their lives in most cases. And then the third phase, I should say, of this policy was the creation of the Croatian Orthodox Church for those remaining Serbs who wished to be Orthodox. And in fact, that was, from then on, there was not so much persecution. But this was, as it were, the second phase. The forced conversion was the second phase of a state policy which the Church always opposed. Jure Kristo has published it some years ago. All of these are official statements from the Bishops' Conference. We know these were sent by Stepinac as well to Pavlic with very, very hostile covering letters saying that it had been a disaster what was happening. And this was actually not just from Stepinac, it was from other bishops as well. And we also have evidence at the trial, though all this evidence was removed from the official version of the trial, there were 7 witnesses were in the end allowed for the defense, and several of these witnesses describe how Stepinac and people working for him were at odds, fighting really with the position of the NDH, the Ustasha, on this matter, and the Church would not allow the state to take control of this. Beyond that, of course, it wasn't just a matter of forced conversions, but also there's a question of killings. And again, within 6 weeks of the declaration of the NDH, Stepinac wrote a fierce letter to Pavlic, condemning the killing of 260 Serbs in Glina. So from the first, he was absolutely firm in resisting and opposing persecution of the Serbs.
Mnogi koji smatraju da Stepinac ne bi trebao biti proglašen svetim, ne osporavaju činjenicu, jer za to postoje dokazi, da je on pomagao onima koji su bili progonjeni, ali kažu da je trebao učiniti više. Jasnije se javno oduprijeti. Što vi kažete?
Well, of course, in theory, one could say that anybody might have done more in any situation, but I don't think that, and of course, one can argue almost indefinitely as to whether somebody should have said something differently or said something more forcefully or so on. But I think that, to my mind, when I looked at all of the evidence, all the things that he did say, and he did speak very openly, for example, in attacking racism and the persecution of the Jews, for example, in his great Christ the King sermon in 1942, which one can read, the very strong attacks on racism. But one can always say, well, should he have done more, should he have done less? Looking at all the evidence, I am convinced that if he had done things differently, I don't believe that as a result of doing things differently, even one more life would have been saved. That really is the question. I mean, anybody can make a judgment which is not quite right, but do I think anybody would have lived who did not live if Stepinac had behaved differently? No, I do not. And when you ask those who attack Stepinac for not doing enough, they can't come up with a satisfactory answer to that anyway. Stepinac wanted Croatia to have its own state. Now, of course, for years that was held against him because it was somehow proof that the only state that the Croats could have was, the implication was an NDH-style fascist state. But of course, after the fall of communism, the end of the Cold War, almost all nations, once again, as before 1945, they have their own, one way or another, they have their own states. So national self-determination, which Stepinac he talked in terms of that national. He said, why shouldn't small states have the same rights as big states? And he said that the Holy See had always said that they should have the same rights as big states and so on. He was condemned automatically. And it is still the case that you will find that the main reason why the Serbs in particular attack him is that on je pozdravio NDH. But the point is, what he wanted was he wanted Croats to have their own state, and he was quite right, because in the first Yugoslavia and in the second Yugoslavia, it was shown that it was not possible for Croats or for the Catholic Church to receive equal rights and respect in any kind of Yugoslavia.
Tko danas plasira, nastavlja plasirati laži o Stepincu? Mi formalno više nemamo komunističke partije. Ili imamo?
I think that there are two questions there, and I'll answer both. Once poison has got into the body politic, the political system, the social system, it's a bit like having some very bad poison in your own system. It's extremely difficult to get rid of. Extremely difficult to get rid of. And most of this poison, which is floating around and which resurfaces and causes bumps and illnesses and so on, which we see in this regard, has been there really from the 1940s. It was then regurgitated and carried on, first of all, by the communists, and now, unfortunately, by the Serbian Orthodox Church, and indeed by the Serbian state, repeatedly. They rehearse this. I think that has a sort of momentum. Now, there is also a problem that those who, the former communists, the old communists, who never seem to die, they just seem to get older. And even when they die, somehow their children and their connections somehow seem to live after them and seem to be just as bad. But anyway, somehow these people, of course, do not want to recognize that they were in the wrong, that they were part of a vicious and totalitarian regime which persecuted not just Stepinac, but the church and thousands and thousands and thousands of innocent people, and all the people that they sent to Stara Gradiška and persecuted there. They do not want to accept that any of this was true. And so all the time you will find resurfacing in the press here, and in media comments which have been passed into them from these networks. And this is very unfortunate, and one has to unfortunately say that these are polluted sources, and that those who have an interest in doing this should not be believed. And unfortunately, one also has to say that these people, perhaps some of them, would be better off shutting up, because perhaps if they say too much, they might finish up in court themselves.
Kažete da se molite za kanonizaciju Stepinca. Zašto? Što vi vidite sveto u tom čovjeku?
One has to get things clear about this. Canonization doesn't mean that somebody sort of has climbed up some celestial ladder and gets from here into heaven. I mean, it's a statement that they are in heaven and that they are an example for the rest of us, and such a good example and so close to God because of their heroic virtues, that it's a good idea for us to pray to that person, hoping that he or she will intercede for us. So the reason why somebody is canonized is actually an act, as it were, of generosity to people today. It doesn't do the canonized person any good at all. I mean, he is in heaven, I have no doubt about that. But of course, if he is canonized, two things will happen. There's the general political thing, I suppose, that I think that there will be fewer lies told about him. But the other thing is that people throughout the world will know who Stepinac is. They will look at his example. And there is so much suffering that Christians go through in the world. For example, the horrible things that have been happening in Egypt, the persecution of Christians there and so on, that people throughout the world can see that here was somebody who went through a great deal, held to the truth, always tried to do the right thing, and in the end died for the truth, because he is a martyr, even though he was not actually, or probably not killed. I mean, his life was lost in the service of the church. And so it is good for the world as a whole that the world should know this, and that Catholics throughout the world should ask for his intercession. That's what the purpose is. And we want to have more grace in the world, and Stepinac, as a canonized saint, would be a channel for more grace in the world.
Postoje li možda i na zapadu, spomenuli ste Egipat, Siriju, znamo što se događa, ali postoje li neke vrste progona kršćana već sada i na zapadu? Jesu li jednako na neki način izloženi određenim iskušenjima, omalovažavanjima?
There is, in some countries, there is a discrimination against faithful Christians. That is certainly true in the West.
U kojim zemljama?
Well, I would say that in the United States anyway, but it may be in other countries too, where you have, but particularly in the United States, I think where there has been this development of political correctness, the Catholic views about abortion, feminism, homosexuality and other matters. These things are now regarded as so completely unacceptable that if you hold what is the Catholic position, namely that marriage has to be between a man and a woman, and that a man has a particular role, a woman has a particular role, I'm not talking about a professional role, but that there is an inherently different role for men and women, and that abortion is a great evil because the child has a soul and lives from the moment of conception. If you hold these sort of things, so for example, if you were working as a doctor in a hospital in America, this is becoming the case as well in Britain, I'm sure it's elsewhere, it will be very, very difficult for you to keep on practicing in accord with your faith in those situations. So that is a real and increasing problem of discrimination against Catholics and Christians. But again, we mustn't exaggerate, and we have to fight this, but we shouldn't whine and complain. I mean, I have never been any subject to any persecution at all. Well, perhaps there will be in the future, who knows, I don't want any, but there we are. But the point is that if there are no difficulties for Christians in life, it would be a sort of proof that actually we weren't worth anything at all. I mean, our Lord said that his supporters should expect to carry a cross. I mean, it may be a small cross, it may be a big cross, but if there are no crosses, then one has to really wonder whether one's doing one's duty. I will give you an example of the way in which things work. Well, first of all, what I've said about doctors and midwives practicing in Britain is extremely difficult. I think that it would be quite difficult for people working in universities, teaching universities, who might have to teach things that they didn't agree with, or at school things that they didn't agree with. But again, one probably shouldn't exaggerate. But an example of how this new regime of political correctness actually is working against the Catholic Church is the fact that there are now almost there may be none at all, no adoption agencies, Catholic adoption agencies functioning in Britain at all. And this is because the law says that you must not discriminate against same-sex couples when you are deciding whether a child should be fostered or not. And so in other words, you have two men who are living in a sexual relationship, or two women living in a sexual relationship. They must be given the same priority as somebody who is living in an ordinary family when it comes to the future of a child. Now, the Catholic Church and its adoption agencies will not accept that, and because of that, they have had to close.
Vi ste se odgojili u anglikanskoj obitelji, bili ste anglikanac, a onda sa 26 godina ste prešli na katoličanstvo. Zašto?
I was born into a Protestant family. I should just qualify it slightly. And then, because it was a sort of typical, I loved my father and mother, but there was really no religious element, not very much religious element in their lives. What they were, I do not know. I think they were more or less Christian, but that's typically British, mixed up. And then I became, I would say, an Anglican, and a practicing Anglican, first at school and then when I was at Oxford. And at Oxford University, I became what we would call an Anglo-Catholic, which is in the Anglican Church, those who are, shall we say, on the Catholic sort of side of the Anglican Church, because the Anglican Church was created by the state. It's a state church, and first of all, the head of the church, now I think she calls herself the supreme governor of the church, is the monarch. So it was created as a political entity, and is a political entity, and so you can have all sorts of different views as long as they're Protestant in it. Just to explain my position, as I became more serious in my faith, I became more interested in truth, in the truth of the various claims of bodies of Christians to be the church. What is the church? We know that from what we read in the Gospels that our Lord founded a church, and because he said that the gates of hell will not prevail against it, my church. This church he founded, and it will last until the last day. But what is this church? And was the church that I was in, the Anglican church, part of that church? Well, in the end I concluded that it was not. There were various reasons. One of them, which is misunderstood, was the question of the ordination of women to the priesthood. Now, I left the Anglican church before that, but it was clear that that could happen, and indeed it did happen. And the issue there was it possible for one group of Christians, namely the Anglicans, to decide unilaterally that there would be a completely different view of the priesthood than that which was held by other Catholics, other Catholics. Well, I don't think it was possible, and so that was one reason. And then there's this question, you see, Christ could not have founded the Protestant church. Whatever he founded, he did not found the Protestant church, because there was no Protestant church until the 16th century. He could not have founded the Protestant church. And this, of course, is the basis of why Protestantism simply cannot possibly offer the truth in the name, in my view, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, about the things that really matter, because the doctrine is not his doctrine. It's not the doctrine which has been passed down over the centuries through tradition. And but for me, I suppose the final thing was, in the Anglican Church, and specifically in this Catholic style bit of the Anglican Church, we had something that we would either call the Eucharist or the Mass. Now, when the priest said, "This is my body, this is my blood," was it Christ's body? Or was it Christ's blood? Or was it a big, well, not a joke, but just a nothingness, like some kind of a play, you know, a fiction? Because that would be a terrible thought. And I concluded that I could not know that it was not fiction. And I did know, I was absolutely convinced that when a Catholic priest performed the Mass, our Blessed Lord became, in body and blood, present on the altar. And that is an enormous question about whether it happens or not. And you can't just say, "Oh, well, he might be, or he might not be," and then just carry on. You can't, if you're interested in the truth. So I felt I had to become a Catholic, to be sure that when I received what appeared to be bread and what appeared to be wine, I was really receiving our Blessed Lord's body and blood. So that's how I became, and felt I had to become, a Catholic rather than a Protestant of any kind.
Bili ste savjetnik Margaret Thatcher, to smo već kazali na početku. Možete li nama Hrvatima savjetovati nešto što bismo trebali činiti za ekonomski i društveni procvat naše države? Evo, vi ste i naš državljanin, živite tu s nama.
Well, one of the things that Mrs. Thatcher was good about was she wasn't just efficient and effective in political decisions. She always explained them. She always understood, and this is something that they simply don't understand here in politics. There's no point in saying, "This is my policy," and say it to the sabor, and then thinking that everybody's going to think it's a good idea. You have to explain why you want to do something. You have to explain what your short-term objective is, but also what your long-term objective is. There is no possible improvement or reforms that can be made in the economy by government without some pain and some loss to some people. It cannot be done. So you have to explain to people that today's problems, though they are real, or tomorrow's problems, though they will be real, but in the future, this is worth doing. So, for example, remodeling industry and that sort of thing, that you have to explain why you are doing things. And she was very good at that. You have to be a teacher, not just a doer. They do not understand this, partly because most Croatian politicians do not have any internal directing values and philosophy at all, unfortunately. And that is true of the right as it is the left. So I'm not making a political point, well, I am, but not an ideological point there. Now, the other thing is that if you want to have a successful economy in Croatia, and the Croatian economy is not successful, it has a little bit of growth, but this growth, if I get a ball and I throw it, at least a rubber ball, I throw it onto the ground, it will bounce a bit. What we're seeing is a little bit of a bounce in the Croatian economy. And it's also a sort of bounce in the European economy. But it doesn't mean that there has been any fundamental reform in the Croatian economy at all. Croatia has a socialist economy, and socialist economies do not work. The state is far too big, intervention is almost ubiquitous, there is far too much regulation. As a result of all of this, far too much politicization. Decisions are made about who should do what task simply because of political loyalty. The main reason to actually be part of a party, as far as I can see, is actually so that you can get privileges. This is clientelism, not capitalism. And the only way that you get growth and jobs is to have clean capitalism. That's what she would say in Croatia. And at the moment, we haven't got it.
Kako se slaže kapitalizam I kršćanstvo? Ide to zajedno?
They can go together, but there's always going to be some conflict. I would say that Christianity is always going to be, there's going to be some tension between Christianity and any other ideology or view. Now that doesn't mean that somehow Christianity can be, Christianity doesn't have a set of rules. This is how you can run politics, this is how you can run the state, let alone this is how you can run the economy. But there will always be some kind of tension between the two, and we shouldn't be too worried about that. And the risk is that with capitalism, people become so obsessed with becoming wealthy that they don't want to be good. That's the problem. And of course, this is a risk. But I should say that under socialism, there are equally risks, because socialism, you may say that capitalism is based on greed, but I would say that socialism is based on envy. And envy is and there's a lot of envy in Croatian society. You even have this word jal. I know this, and there's lots of jal. And this is an inheritance of socialism. So you can be a good Christian, and you can have effective capitalism. After all, private property and being rich there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that at all. I mean, Joseph of Arimathea was clearly a rich man. He was able to provide, thinking about Easter, he was able to provide a nice clean tomb for our blessed Lord. And he was able to do that. That was a good use of his resources. And we won't have the same we won't be able to use our money on the same sort of thing, but there is nothing wrong with having a good standard of living, and you need it for your children, and you need it in order to give to causes. There's nothing wrong with wealth at all. Nothing wrong with wealth, but we also have to remember that our destination, ultimate destination is, or the destination we should want, is to be with God, and not just to have a nice looking yacht, as you would see off the Split River. Nice to have a yacht, but don't get obsessed with the yacht.
Profesore Haris, hvala vam lijepa I želim vam dobar život u Hrvatskoj.
Hvala.
Poštovani gledatelji, ovo je emisija Vidljivi tragovi. Ostanite I dalje uz radosnu vijest. Doviđenja.